Between the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, and the formal surrender signed on September 2, 1945, Japan lost somewhere between 2.5 and 3.1 million military and civilian lives, depending on which historical source you consult for the population count at the start of the war. Around 67 cities had been heavily bombed by U.S. B-29s by the time the war ended in September 1945. Industrial capacity had been gutted by years of strategic bombing, and reports indicate that roughly 90% of Japan's steel production capacity had been physically destroyed before surrender was signed on the battleship Missouri. Per capita income in 1950 was reported to be on the order of Ethiopia and Somalia at the time, and roughly 40% below contemporary India, which is hard to square with the image of Japan as an industrial powerhouse today, and is the first useful number to keep in mind when you think about the scale of the recovery needed. Recovery to pre-war production levels, using the 1934 to 1936 benchmark, was roughly achieved between 1950 and 1952, according to World Bank documentation, with real per capita GDP surpassing pre-war levels around 1955 to 1956, and a clean industrial climb underway across the same decade in the same country under a new political setup. By 1968, Japan had become the second largest economy in the world, behind only the United States, a position the country held for more than 4 consecutive decades before China overtook it in nominal GDP rankings in the 2010. And that climb from wartime ruin to second place took 23 years from 1945 in the historical record. Phase 1 of the climb was occupation, and the Dodge Line from 1945 through 1949, with the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, under General Douglas MacArthur overseeing punitive reforms that dissolved the Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates and reshaped land ownership across the rural economy of the country. The occupation oversaw land reform that transferred ownership from absentee landlords to tenant farmers, a new labor law framework that legalized unions for the first time in Japanese history, and a new constitution that renounced war and demoted the emperor to a symbolic role in the new political structure of the country for decades to come. The most important economic decision came in 1949 in what historians call the Dodge Line, named after Joseph Dodge, a Detroit banker brought in by President Truman to stabilize Japanese public finance and to put a hard ceiling on government spending across the same fiscal year in Tokyo. The Dodge Line imposed a balanced national budget, ended government subsidies to industry, froze credit to weak borrowers, and fixed the yen at 360 yen per U.S. dollar, a rate that held from 1949 until 1971, and shaped every export decision during the entire post-war climb period. The result was a sharp recession in 1949 and 1950, with unemployment briefly exceeding levels seen in the United States during the 1930s. But inflation was halted within months of the policy being implemented, and price stabilization was the precondition for the credit-driven recovery that followed in the same decade. Without inflation under control, none of the lending-based recovery could function at scale, and that is why the Dodge Line recession is treated as one of the most important macroeconomic policy decisions of the entire 20th century in Japan, rather than as a footnote in the post-war history books. Phase 2 was the Korean War procurement boom from 1950 to 1953, with the Korean War breaking out in June 1950, and Japan immediately sitting behind the front line as a logistics base for UN forces and U.S. material contracts moving through Japanese ports on a steady schedule during the conflict. UN forces needed a logistics base, and Japan was already industrialized, already cleared of wartime munitions, and physically adjacent to the Korean peninsula, which is why the special procurements placed by U.S. and UN contracting entities with Japanese industry pumped an estimated roughly $3 billion in 1950s dollars into Japanese manufacturers between 1950 and 1953. That Korean War procurement wave contributed heavily to GDP growth, averaging around 7.9% across 1950 to 1958, with the 1951 to 1952 window showing a visible Korean War spike in the industrial data on the same calendar every month of the boom period in Japan. The boom rebuilt idle factories that had been bombed during the war and reintroduced Japanese manufacturing capacity to global commerce without foreign currency risk on the export side, because the contracts were denominated in U.S. dollars paid directly by U.S. military procurement officers to Japanese corporate bank accounts during the same period. Japanese real GNP grew at roughly 10% annually across the 1950 after the recession bottomed out, and industrial output recovered the pre-war 1934 to 1936 benchmark by 1953 to 1954, according to official Japanese government statistics for the period under the new political setup in Tokyo. Phase 3 was the income doubling plan launched in 1960 by Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda, a 10-year program explicitly designed to double Japanese national income by 1970, using a coordinated set of fiscal, monetary, and industrial policy tools designed by economist Osamu Shimomura and a small team in the same government. Tools included tax cuts for households, expansion of the social safety net for working families, aggressive public sector infrastructure investment in highways, ports, and rail, cheap credit to priority industries, and a fixed exchange rate that undervalued the yen and supported export-led growth for the entire decade of the 1960s. The actual result exceeded the target. Japanese national income more than doubled by 1967, 3 years ahead of the original 1970 deadline, and Japan's gross national product grew at an average of more than 10% per year across 1960 to 1970 in real terms on the calendar. By 1964, Japan's hosting of the Tokyo Olympics signaled the country's reintegration with the global economy to international audiences, and the Shinkansen bullet train opened in the same year between Tokyo and Osaka at a speed and reliability that no Western intercity rail system was matching at the same time on the same continent. By the late 1960s, Japan was producing more steel than West Germany and had become the world's largest shipbuilder by gross tonnage launched from Japanese yards per year, with Korean and Chinese yards still years away from competing for that volume on the global shipbuilding market in the same decade. By 1968, the country had overtaken West Germany to become the world's second-largest economy in nominal GDP, a position Japan held for more than 4 consecutive decades, until being surpassed by China in 2010, in the same nominal GDP rankings used by the IMF and World Bank at the time of measurement. Phase 4 was industrial policy and protected domestic market structure, with the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, coordinating industrial policy with vigor across the 1960s and 1970s, and selected industries being given protected domestic markets, favored access to credit, and direct guidance on export strategy. The pattern was explicitly modeled on the earlier German customs union experience, although the Japanese version was considerably more concentrated in the specific industries chosen for protection each year and ran for a longer uninterrupted window of policy consistency under the same political party at the national level. Sectors that benefited from the protected market structure included steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, electronics, and petrochemicals, with each of these sectors getting explicit industrial policy support across the same decade in the form of below-market credit from the Japan Development Bank and direct coordination with media officials in Tokyo. The buildup of keiretsu, horizontal and vertical corporate groups linked through cross-shareholdings and reciprocal supplier relationships, lowered transaction costs within each group, facilitated patient capital, and protected domestic firms from short-term shareholder pressure for the entire era of the climb to second-largest economy in 1968. Critics later argued the keiretsu structure suppressed innovation in consumer-facing industries, while defenders counter that it produced a generation of firms competitive in heavy industry at scale that the U.S. and European private capital structures could not match on raw output volume during the same years on the world market. Phase 5 was cultural discipline as competitive advantage, with Japanese industrial culture in the same window combining lifetime employment with company-based welfare, Kaizen continuous improvement at the line level, and a deep bench of engineers in electrical, mechanical, and chemical disciplines hired from the same handful of elite universities each year. The combination produced quality gains that were measurable on the assembly line and that were eventually visible to consumers around the world, with the phrase "made in Japan" shifting from a post-war joke to a global badge of reliable manufacture within a single generation of consumer durables sold in U.S. retail stores. Sony's 1955 release of the TR-55 transistor radio and Toyota's emergence as a credible competitor to the U.S. Big Three by the late 1960s were public markers of the shift that consumers in the West could see for themselves in showrooms and electronic stores on the same shopping visits they made every month. Phase 6 was the Plaza Accord and the bubble, with the 1985 Plaza Accord among the G5 pulling the yen from roughly 240 per dollar to roughly 150 per dollar within just 2 years, while the Bank of Japan cut rates to offset the export shock caused by the same currency appreciation on the export side of the economy. The combination produced the largest asset bubble in modern industrial history. The Nikkei 225 sextupled between 1985 and 1989. Urban land prices multiplied several times over those same years, and Imperial Palace land in central Tokyo was reportedly worth more than the entire state of California at the bubble's peak in 1989. That quote, attributed to a Tokyo banker at the time, has never been precisely verified, but reflects broadly accepted assessments of the magnitude of the urban land price bubble in central Tokyo during the same couple of years in the late 1980, before the bubble collapsed in 1990 and 1991. Across the same real estate market. The bubble collapsed in 1990 and 1991, and Japan entered what became known as the lost decades, a multi-decade period of low growth, deflation, and balance sheet recession during which the country remained the third or fourth largest economy in nominal GDP for years, despite the loss of momentum in the domestic market. Yet the fundamental infrastructure of the recovery, the industrial base, the savings culture, the engineering talent pipeline from elite universities, the brand equity in global consumer electronics, and the export capacity in automobiles had been built, and that infrastructure kept Japan among the largest economies in the world for decades after the bubble collapsed. By the early 1980s, Japan's economic model was being intensively studied by U.S. policymakers in Washington and on Wall Street, with Ezra Vogel's Japan as #1. Published in 1979, becoming a runaway bestseller in the United States and remaining a reference point for American industrial policy debates even decades later in 2026. Factories that had been shuttered in Detroit and Pittsburgh in the late 1970s were being reopened by Japanese transplants to the United States during the 1980s, marking the first wave of Japanese foreign direct investment in American manufacturing on a scale large enough to displace significant U.S. employment in the same industries. Sony Corporation surpassed established U.S. electronics firms in market capitalization within a single decade of the late 1980s and early 1990s, and Honda entered the U.S. motorcycle market in the 1950s and built a dominant automotive franchise by the 1980s across the same consumer categories on the same showroom floors. Japan's growth from about 1955 GDP per capita to the second largest economy in the world by 1968 was the fastest sustained climb any major economy had achieved in the 20th century on the same calendar. And the duration of the climb was 13 years from per capita GDP recovery to second place in nominal GDP. The climb from absolute wartime ruin in 1945 to second largest economy in 1968, measured instead from the surrender on the battleship Missouri, was 23 years across the same calendar on the same continent for the same political entity under different constitutional orders and different occupation regimes through the same decades. The combined record of rebuilding, recovery, and overtaking Germany to become the second largest economy is the closest thing to a controlled economic miracle the post-war period produced, and it remains the source of almost every modern debate about industrial policy, trade strategy, and East Asian state economy relations in 2026. Per capita income in 1950 was reported roughly comparable to Ethiopia and Somalia at the time, and about 40% below contemporary India, and the recovery to pre-war 1934 GDP levels by 1955 to 1956 took only about 5 years from the per capita income low point in the same decade on the same calendar. Korean War special procurements injected roughly $3 billion in 1950s dollars into Japan between 1950 and 1953, equal to a substantial share of 1 year's GDP at the time. And that procurement wave was a larger stimulus to industrial recovery than any later stimulus program designed in the same country in later decades. U.S. financial aid through the Garioa and counterpart funds programs totaled roughly $1.9 to $2. $0 billion between 1945 and 1952, meaningful, but smaller in scale than the Korean War procurements of the same period that followed the occupation-era aid on the same calendar across the same fiscal years. Japanese real GDP growth exceeded 10% in multiple individual years during the 1960s under the income doubling plan, and the climb from second-largest economy by 1968 is the most cited benchmark for the overall speed of the climb by any major economy in the same century in the same data set. Japan overtook West Germany to become the second-largest economy in nominal GDP in 1968, and held that position for more than 4 consecutive decades, until 2010, when China overtook Japan in the same nominal GDP rankings used by international statistical agencies on the same calendar in the same year of measurement. Japan's share of global GDP rose from roughly 1% in 1945 at the end of the war to more than 17% at the late 1980s bubble peak in 1989, before settling back down to single-digit percentages in the 21st century, as China's share grew rapidly across the same calendar in the same global rankings. By 1985, Japanese automakers were producing more than 12 million vehicles per year, exceeding U.S. output per capita and dramatically exceeding European output per capita, with most of those vehicles exported to North America and sold through dealer networks that had been built over the previous decade on the same continent. Japanese steel production reached the world's largest national total by the late 1970s and remained the largest national total for several consecutive years before China took the same #1 spot in steel output in the 1990s under a very different industrial policy approach in the same global steel market on the same calendar. The Plaza Accord of 1985 appreciated the yen by roughly 50% against the dollar, within just 2 years of the agreement being signed. And that appreciation helped trigger the asset bubble that peaked in 1989 in Tokyo real estate, and the Nikkei 225 equity index that collapsed the same way in 1990 across the same country. The combined record from wartime ruin in 1945 to second-largest economy by 1968, and then to the world's largest asset bubble by 1989 before the lost decades, is the closest thing to a controlled economic experiment any major economy has produced in the modern post-war era, and it remains the reference case in 2026. The headline from the whole Reconstruction story is that a country bombed to ruins in 1945 became the second-largest economy in the world by 1968 through a deliberate combination of price stabilization, foreign procurement, export-led growth, domestic savings, and patient industrial policy coordinated across the same calendar in the same country for the same 23 years. The same infrastructure that built the climb also built the bubble, which means the Japanese case is not a flawless success story, but the closest thing to a controlled economic experiment any major economy has produced in the modern era, and it remains the reference case for industrial policy debates in Washington and Tokyo in 2026.